guys, thanks for watching my vlog. This is part 2 of day 3, and this is the last bit of the concentration camp walking tour. If you are feeling a little bit under the weather, I would suggest for you to skip this episode because
stormed onto the roll call. Until after the pogrom of November 9th, 1938, when mass arrests of around 30,000 Jews took place all over Germany, that deportation was begun to the concentration camps on a large scale. The 6,000 Jewish men who were delivered to the SACHSENHAUSEN concentration camp were squeezed into the barracks in the small camp, which had only just been completed. Since at that time it was the policy of the National Socialists to encourage the emigration of the Jews from Germany, most of the survivors were released several weeks later, on condition that they left the country without delay. However, many of the older prisoners left their lives here as a direct result of the prison conditions and mistreatment by the SS. 1,200 Polish Jews who were interned in Sachsenhausen after the start of the war, with Germany's attack on Poland, were treated as a measure of the SS that ensured the deaths of several prisoners through suffocation.
The windows of the barracks were nailed shut, and the ventilation flaps too. The windows were sealed with paper strips that ensured that no air could get in from outside. The rooms in which we slept at night were hermetically sealed, and there was a permanent shortage of air in there when the door wasn't open.
Hitler himself participated in a momentous act of protest by the prisoners, unique in the history of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. On October 22nd, 1942, all Jewish prisoners were ordered to step forward since they were to be transported off to Auschwitz. However, only a few months previously, 250 Jewish prisoners had been murdered in one single action, and the prisoners therefore feared that their true destination was to be the execution trench in the industrial yard. This triggered a desperate feeling of rebellion among Hüttner and 17 of his comrades from Barrack 39. Determined not to go quietly to their deaths, they broke through the ring of SS Blockführer and stormed onto the roll call ground with the cry,
We will not be slaughtered. We will die fighting.
They were overpowered, but not specially punished, and were sent to Auschwitz as originally planned. Some even survived. The vast majority of the Jewish prisoners had been deported to Auschwitz for extermination by October 1942, and until 1944, only a handful of Jews remained here in special work detachments inside the camp. A few months before the end of the war, the SS divided off the small camp with barbed wire. In this enclosure, Women who had been evacuated from subsidiary camps were penned in, including a large consignment of Jewish women from Hungary. Barracks 38 and 39, which you see before you, were reconstructed from parts of other barracks for the National Memorial Site of the GDR in 1961, in order to house a small exhibition on the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis. This had not even been taken into account in the original plans for the memorial site, which led to wide-ranging international protests. In the night of September 25th, 1992, only a few days after the official visit of Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, the two barracks were partly destroyed by fire, following an attack by right-wing arsonists. They have been reconstructed in such a way that the traces of the attack can still be seen. Barrack 38 now houses the permanent exhibition, Jewish Prisoners in the Concentration Camp, 1936 to 1945. To listen to a comment from the head of the memorial, Professor Günter Morsch, on the attack, please enter the number 115 on your audio guide.
Im Herbst 1992 besuchte der damalige israelische Ministerpräsident Yitzhak Rabin die Gedenkstätte Sachsenhausen.
In the autumn of 1992, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, visited the Sachsenhausen memorial site. This state visit has been regularly repeated by the subsequent Prime Ministers of Israel, all of whom have officially visited Sachsenhausen since. In the course of his tour of the site, Rabin also visited the reconstructed Jewish barracks 38 and 39, which at that time still held the original exhibition of the GDR on the suffering and resistance of the Jewish prisoners from the Third Reich. The media covered this visit extensively. A few days later, a group of neo-Nazis scaled the walls of the memorial grounds by night and made their way to the Jewish barracks, where they threw incendiary devices into the buildings, which was soon ablaze. The barracks were partly burnt to the ground. In particular, the so-called A wing of Barrack 38 was completely destroyed by the attack, while the B wing on the other side was gutted by the fire. Barrack 39 also sustained severe damage. At that time, only a few years after the reunification of Germany, this attack caused a wave of protests. At least 30,000 people marched from Berlin to Sachsenhausen to attend an impressive rally here against the resurgence of right-wing extremism in Germany. Many of the country's politicians attended the protests in Sachsenhausen at that time, such as Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel and the President of the German Bundestag, Professor Rita Süssmuth. A mere matter of weeks later, it was not only the name of Sachsenhausen that was being mentioned in the press in conjunction with the new wave of right-wing violence that was sweeping the land. Names such as Mölln, Solingen, and Lichtenhagen had an even higher significance, not least due to the fact that the neo-Nazi attacks were no longer targeted against mere buildings, far worse, against human beings, and resulted in numerous deaths. Records show that around 100 people are known to have died as victims of right-wing acts of violence in Germany in the period between reunification and the year 2001. Against this background, it is not surprising that the significance of the attack on the Jewish barracks has also undergone a re-evaluation. This gradual shift in priorities was most clearly demonstrated when exactly 10 years later, right-wing extremists set fire to the Death March Museum in the Bielo Woods near Wichita, which also belongs to the foundation. Although many protests were heard in Brandenburg, the news of this attack failed to cause much.
The chances of surviving the concentration camp were slim. There were many ways in which prisoners could lose their lives. They could die of hunger, of diseases, of overwork, of the after effects of a beating, or in the course of a medical experiment. Deaths of this type were called normaler Abgang in the jargon of the SS, which is akin to saying the prisoners died of natural causes. In addition to this, individual prisoners or groups of prisoners were also executed, but in a manner that could be legally defined as murder, by being shot, hanged, or after 1943, gassed. These crimes are documented by the display Murder and Mass Murder in the Concentration Camp, 1936 to 1945, on the eastern wall of the camp. This was the place where, in the industrial yard on the other side, the so-called Station Z was located, with its crematorium, its Genickschußanlage, an installation for shooting prisoners in the base of the skull, its gas chamber, and its execution trench. The greatest single concerted act of mass murder in the history of Sachsenhausen was the execution of at least 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war in the late summer and autumn of 1941. Before being transferred to Sachsenhausen, these prisoners had been sorted out in prisoner-of-war camps of the Wehrmacht on the basis of Hitler's infamous Kommissar order, which ordered the summary execution of any political commissars and Jews among the Russian prisoners of war. In order to carry out the murders, the SS set up a temporary but complicated contraption for administering the Genickschuss, a single shot in the base of the skull, in a wooden hut not far from the execution trench. The prisoners were led into a room where an SS man in a white laboratory coat made a pretense of conducting a medical examination, in the course of which they had to stand against a stadiometer or height measurement affixed to one of the walls. The stadiometer had a hidden firing slit through which an SS man in the next room shot the prisoners in the back of the head as they stood there. Military march music was played at high volume on a gramophone throughout the procedure to drown out any noises. In 1962, the prisoner Paul Sakowski, who was on forced duty during these murders, reported on what he had witnessed.
Sergeants Kessler and Dinggrafe, both wearing white coats, shouted at me to pull him out of the way. Only then did I see a naked man lying on the floor. I gripped him by the wrists and dragged him out into the hallway, where Ficker told me to put him with the other two corpses in the corner. As I dragged him through the wood shavings, I noticed he was leaving a trail of blood. In the corner, I turned the body around onto its front and saw a thin trickle of blood coming out of a small hole in the base of the man's head at the back.
The headshot installation, installed in the so-called Station Z building when it was built in 1942, worked along much the same lines. It was first used in May 1942, when 250 Jews were shot there. Most of the increasing number of murders that were committed by the SS in Sachsenhausen in the following years were carried out with the aid of the so-called headshot installation, the Genickschußanlage, in Station Z. As late as the spring of 1945, summary executions took place here. These were of people caught looting after bombing raids, but also of prisoners, mainly women, suspected of sabotage at their place of work in the arms factories. Jews arriving from other camps that had already been evacuated were disposed of here, as were prisoners sorted out in the infirmary as being incapable of further work. In February 1945, the SS shot a number of Soviet, British, and Luxembourg military and police officers as a preventative measure, hoping to reduce the risk of a prisoner's revolt being led by men trained in military or gassing trucks. These gas vans, as they became known, had been specially developed by the Crime Science Institute of Department 2 of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the main security office of the Reich,
and were equipped with an airtight cabin into which the exhaust fumes of the vans were directly piped, the idea being that those locked into the cabin would suffocate and die of carbon monoxide poisoning. To listen to the report of the prisoner, Harry Naujoks, on the murder of the Soviet prisoners of war in Sachsenhausen, the greatest single act of organized mass murder to be carried out in the history of the concentration camp, please enter the number 124 on your audio guide. As an employee of the Crime Science Institute, Dr. Theodor Leidig observed the employment of the gas vans. To listen to the testimony he gave as a witness in a legal trial in West Germany in 1959, please enter the number 224.
First came a small group of Soviet prisoners of war. 3 days later, they were collected in a van and driven to the Genickschussanlage, the headshot installation, to be shot. Our thoughts, our discussions all centered on the question, what can we do? We had to do something. The first idea that came into our minds was that we must get bread to them somehow, simply as a sign of our solidarity. They should not die without knowing that there were people who cared about their fate. The next thing was that they must be informed of the murderous plan of the SS. Before the next transport arrived, Rudi Grosse wrote a message in Cyrillic letters on strips of Russian clothes that read, "We are all going to be shot." We hid 3 or 4 such strips in the barracks that we had to make ready in preparation for the new arrivals. However, as we were doing this, we had doubts that our intention would work, since the poor light in the barracks made it unlikely that the small strips would be discovered at all, except by chance. And then there was the problem of deciphering what was written on them. The deaths of the Soviet prisoners of war in Sachsenhausen were not reported. Neither the next of kin were informed, nor was the International Red Cross, nor the Swedish government, which as a neutral state was taking care of the interests of the Soviet Union. There were no soldiers' graves, not even a marked mass grave or any other place where one might assume the ashes of the victim to lie. The only thing that remained of each Soviet soldier was his identification tag. These tags were taken off when the prisoners were stripped, lay in between their bundles of clothes, and were thrown in with the general rubbish or in the fires. These little metal tags were all that remained to bear witness to the fact that the prisoners had been here at all. It was because of this realization that I started to collect every single tag I could find. More and more prisoners participated in this and handed in the tags they had collected to the prisoners' orderly room. We had a box in which they could be put. One day, Rapportführer Kampe came into the orderly room with an order from the camp command that our collection of tags was to be handed over. I managed to finish counting them shortly before they were actually collected and came to a total of 10,034. In Sachsenhausen, we went off to some barracks or other that were in a special barbed wire enclosure. And there was a van there that was very similar to the one I had seen in the courtyard of the Criminal Investigation Department headquarters. A group of naked men came out of the barracks and were told to get into the back of the van, as if they were simply boarding a bus. These men obviously had no idea what was about to happen. The number of men who got into the van was about 30. Then the van drove off. I noticed a row of corpses that had been laid out in front of the barracks. They must have been carried there before. These corpses were also naked. Then I asked someone who they were, the people lying there and the ones who had got into the van. I was told that the corpses were people who had already gone kaput, starved to death or died of other causes. It's possible that this rather callous answer was given by an SS camp guard. Apparently the people who had been driven away in the van were Russians, who would have been shot anyway. They were just trying to see if they could kill them in a different way instead. We then went off to a different area of the camp, which proved to be near the crematorium, where we saw the van once more. I remember that there was a small window through which you could see into the interior of the van, which was lit, and you could see that the people inside were all dead. Then the van was opened, Some of the corpses fell out of their own accord, and the rest were unloaded by prisoner workers. We chemists could see that the corpses all had a pink tinge to their skin, as is consistent with death by carbon monoxide poisoning.
Before you lie the two infirmary barracks R1 and R2. The infirmary of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp comprised a further 3 barracks, which are no longer preserved today. You will notice the unusual length of the barracks. Originally, the infirmary consisted of a mere 2 barracks of the standard size and type. By 1938-39, these were no longer adequate, so each of the barracks was extended to join up with the one in front. At the same time, cellars were built beneath the buildings in order to house other functional rooms that were needed. Later still, the infirmary was expanded with yet more joined-up barracks. Since 2004, these barracks house a permanent exhibition entitled Medical Care and Crime in the Concentration Camp, 1936 to 1945. These are the oldest preserved concentration camp barracks and were carefully restored for this exhibition. At the end, the repeatedly extended infirmary had almost 800 beds in which more than 2,000 patients lay. The wards had very different levels of equipment. The barracks R1 and R2 in particular had quite modern therapy and diagnosis equipment, and were the showcase barracks presented to journalists, state and party functionaries visiting the camp. The other wards, however, lacked even the most basic facilities, and the beds regularly held 2 or more patients. The conditions in these wards were catastrophic. The infirmary was run by the first camp doctor with a staff of other SS doctors. These doctors, however, usually only supervised the medical care provided. The actual hands-on treatment was done by inmate medical orderlies. The available medical care was miserably inadequate. Certain groups of prisoners, such as the Jews or the Roma, would be entirely excluded from it for long periods at a time. Those prisoners who were admitted to the infirmary were initially cared for by orderlies chosen from among the prisoners. Prisoner doctors were not allowed to practice until 1942, when the death toll in the camps reached a level that was regarded as detrimental to the war effort. The workforce of the prisoners was, after all, an important economic factor at the time, and their labor was needed in the arms industry. The infirmary of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp was also the place in which SS doctors carried out forced sterilizations and castrations of inmates. Several thousand concentration camp inmates were the victims of systematically planned euthanasia, such as Operation 14F13, in which more than 5,500 ill inmates of Sachsenhausen concentration camp were killed. Operation 14F13 was named after the file number used in the Oranienburg Inspectorate of concentration camps for murder by gassing. The selected inmates were killed in the death camps of Operation Euthanasia T4, a centrally controlled murder campaign against psychiatric patients by carbon monoxide poisoning. Between April and June of 1941, a committee of doctors from Berlin sorted out 269 prisoners in Sachsenhausen with physical handicaps, chronic illnesses, or supposed mental deficiencies. These were transferred to the Sonnenstein Institute in Pirna, where they were gassed. 2 further similar murder operations followed in the name of eradicating what was termed Lebensunwertes Leben, or life unworthy of life. In the spring of 1945, SS doctors killed a number of patients in the infirmary who they decided would never recover sufficiently to be able to work again. Large numbers of prisoners were also misused for medical experiments by the SS camp doctors, but also by visiting physicians of external SS or Wehrmacht institutions, or even university clinics. In order to be able to test the effectiveness of various remedies for gangrene, often a problem in the hospitals on the front treating bullet or shrapnel wounds, pieces of moldy and decaying straw were sewn into the upper arms or legs of otherwise perfectly healthy prisoners. One of the experiments carried out in the Sachsenhausen Infirmary by a Wehrmacht physician using the facilities involved the infection of 11 Jewish children, especially delivered from Auschwitz, with a special strain of hepatitis virus that had been developed in order to obtain clinical results on the exact symptoms it produced. The prisoner orderly, Bruno Meyer, was responsible for the care of these children, who were held in a small room in the center of the barracks from September 1943 onwards. To hear excerpts from this eyewitness report, please enter the number 134 on your audio guide.
In August 1943, 11 male children of Jewish descent were delivered to the infirmary of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp and quartered in a small room of the infirmary barrack R2. The children, aged between 8 and 15 years, had been sent from the Auschwitz camp, where they had been separated from their parents. As far as I can remember, they were all of Polish nationality.
Wehrmacht Medical Corps officer Dr. Domen arrived by way of the University Clinic of Gießen to examine the children and pronounced them all fit and in sound health. 2 days later, he had the authority, directly from the SS leadership, to begin his experiments. The experiments with the cell cultures containing highly contagious hepatitis viruses continued over the next several weeks. Bruno Meyer continues.
This time, the medical officer brought 2 ampoules with him in his bag, tightly wrapped in paper. As he unwrapped them, I saw that they contained a reddish-brown, slightly gelatinous substance. It occurred to me that this is what the nutritive medium for a virus or bacteria culture would look like. Then he selected 2 of the boys, Saul Hornfeld and Wolf Silberglett, who was the youngest. Both of them were told to strip, and then the medic examined them thoroughly once more. Then he inserted a duodenal tube into both patients, one after the other. After this, the doctor donned rubber gloves, opened the ampoules with a small steel saw, and drew the contents into 2 separate syringes, about 20 cubic centimeters or roughly 3/4 of a fluid ounce each. Next, he fitted the nipple of the syringe into the end of the tube that dangled out of Wolf Silberglett's mouth and squeezed its entire contents into it. It obviously needed some effort to press the glutinous mass into the tube and down into the duodenum.
Dr. Domen carried out the same procedure with Saul Hornfeld. That done, he waited for the first indication of an enlarged liver in the boys, which he first diagnosed several weeks later with Saul Hornfeld. He then carried out a liver biopsy, as Bruno Meyer describes.
Dr. Domen took a long, thick needle out of his instrument bag with a slanted point, stood behind Saul Hornfeld, and after tapping and feeling for position, pushed the needle deep into the boy's back. Saul Hornfeld bit on his knuckles to keep from crying out with pain. I quickly moved up to him and in a strained voice implored him to be brave. Blind with the tears that were running down his bloodless cheeks, he pushed the needle in a second time. Together, Dr. Oftedal and I lifted Saul Hornfeld off the surgery table, and I carried him back to his bed with his little fellow sufferers. I watched him as he lay there in his straw sack, this little lad, with his face turned towards the wall. Great, heart-rending sobs racked his thin body as he cried from the bottom of his soul.
The 6 tombstones before you mark 6 mass graves the final resting place for more than 300 of the last victims of the concentration camp, buried here in the summer of 1945. These prisoners had died of the effects of their internment in the infirmary of the camp after the liberation. The majority of the prisoners did not experience their liberation through the Allied forces in the concentration camp itself. When the commandant ordered the evacuation of the camp in the face of the advancing Allied troops, more than 33,000 prisoners started off in a northwesterly direction towards the Baltic on a forced march in columns of 500 on April 21st, 1945. In cold and wet weather conditions, the prisoner columns, which included women and children, marched between 20 and 40 kilometers each day, between 12.5 and 25 miles, without shelter at night and on inadequate rations. Many of the prisoners, by then already weakened through the conditions in the camp, fell by the way and were shot by the SS guards. After several days of the march, the columns were herded together in the Belo woods near Wittstock, where Red Cross workers who had followed the columns in their white vans and collected as many stragglers as possible before they were shot, distributed food and negotiated a ceasefire with the guards. Many of the prisoners did not survive the death march, but between May 2nd and May 5th, the most of them reached the environs of Schwerin, where they were finally liberated by American and Soviet troops. About 3,000 prisoners remained behind in the camp after the evacuation order, those who were unable to march for reasons of illness or disability, and those prisoner orderlies and prisoner doctors who attended them in the infirmary. They were liberated on the 22nd and 23rd of April 1945, when Polish and Soviet regiments of the Red Army reached SACHSENHAUSEN. It was a few days later that, the Soviet military having taken over the camp, officers of the medical corps took over control of the infirmary, and local women, mainly from Oranienburg, were assigned to nursing duties. Many of the prison orderlies and prisoner doctors continued to provide active support for their sick comrades at that time. One of these was the Dutch medical student Johannes Heers, who remembers.
Even after the liberation, an incredible number of the sick and weak who had remained in the camp after the evacuation continued to die. We had no light and no water, and we had no petrol. So these people continued to die of hunger or infections such as tuberculosis. The only thing we could do was to bury them in mass graves. We simply took the bodies and laid them in the graves without knowing their names or nationalities. We had no time to find these things out because we were afraid of spreading infections and disease in the camp while they waited for a more decent burial. I remember that we laid 50 people in each grave, no more. We put up wooden crosses on which we marked the number of people buried.
These graves were neglected and forgotten during the period that the camp was used as a Soviet special camp, from 1945 to 1950. Not until a former Dutch prisoner reported their existence and location were they rediscovered, tended, and restored in time for the 50th anniversary of the liberation in 1995.
Standing at roll call in the grey morning light, transfixed I gaze at the wires. Sparks dance, glowing and bright, as another friend's life expires. How many sparks have I seen thus fly, ashes sinking into the moss-covered clay? How many brave men have I seen thus die? Might not I also soon choose to end in this way?
In the course of the demolition work on the Sachsenhausen concentration campsite in 1958, a notebook was unearthed containing some 40 poems written in Russian, one of which you have just listened to, in a very approximate translation. For a long time, nothing was known about the author, and this mystery was not solved until very recently. A lieutenant, Alexander Stolyarov, had been deported to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp as a prisoner of war. After the liberation, this unfortunate individual was immediately arrested by the Soviet Secret Service on suspicion of treason, and he was sentenced to a term of imprisonment in a Siberian gulag, which he did not survive. The semicircular roll call ground was surrounded by a track with a varied surface: sand, gravel, cobblestones, etc. This was the so-called shoe testing track. From about 1940 onwards, prisoners in a special punishment detail tested different materials for their suitability as boot soles for the military each day, at the orders of the Reichswirtschaftsministerium, the Ministry of the Economy, and the German shoe industry.
The members of the shoe testing detail were sent around the track with heavy weights on their back, intended to simulate a full infantry kit, according to a set pattern. 2 rounds at the double, followed by several rounds of marching in formation. The boots were distributed with complete disregard to the size of the prisoners' feet, as a result of which many of them developed severe, often crippling deformations and inflammations. From 1943 onwards, the camp command extended the length of a day's march on the testing track from 30 to 40 kilometers. The day's march also included the occasional so-called sports break, which consisted of following a shouted series of arbitrary commands so that they would be forced to alternately lie face down, spring back up to attention, march in review, carry out a series of knee bends, belly crawl, and finally jump on the spot.
The SS supervisors used the march as an added opportunity for harassing and tormenting the prisoners. The shoe testing detachment was one of the possible punishments a prisoner had to endure for offenses against the camp order. The prisoners assigned to this punishment detail were accommodated in an isolation compound, separated from the main prisoners' camp. This consisted of blocks 10, 11, and 12 in the first ring, next to the roll call ground, as well as blocks 34, 35, and 36 immediately behind. Before you lies the area of the small camp. A mere 2 years after the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen was first built, the barracks in the triangular main prisoners' camp had already become too cramped to hold the ever-increasing number of prisoners arriving here. Forced to abandon the original architectural concept, the SS had 18 additional barracks built here in the summer of 1938. The area is rectangular, lies outside the original prisoners' camp, and soon became known as the small camp. The barracks 37, 38, and 39 in the small camp were called the Jewish barracks, since from 1938 to 1942 it was mainly Jewish prisoners who were incarcerated here. From 1940 on, barracks 16 and 17 were reserved for what was called the Stehkommando, or standing detachment. Here prisoners who were too weak to work were forced to stand all day instead, in cramped conditions. Barracks 20, 42, and 62, along the southern camp wall, contained the so-called Loritz works. The workshops were named after the camp commandant, Hans Loritz, who had the prisoners manufacture all manner of articles and merchandise here, mainly for his own use or for use as gifts to friends. After almost all the Jewish prisoners had been deported to other camps, such as Auschwitz, for extermination as part of the Endlösung, or final solution, the SS transferred select Jewish prisoners with professional qualifications in the graphic arts into Sachsenhausen, quartering them in barracks 18 and 19. In front of you lies the western end of the Lagerstrasse, the camp road, which leads into the former Julia Strecker Strasse, now called Donani Street. To the left, at an approximate distance of 200 meters, or 220 yards, and hidden behind a garage building of the SS troop camp, a large building is located. This administration building, called the T building because of its T-shaped ground plan, was built in 1937-38 by prisoners of the concentration camp, the T-bar being added later in 1939. From August 1938 onwards, it housed the Central Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, as well as the command headquarters of all the Totenkopfstandarten, the high command of the Death's Head Division of the SS. The location of these central administrative bodies here in Sachsenhausen underlined the importance of the leading role this camp played in the German concentration camp system. In the years that followed, additional SS offices were established in this building, such as the Waffen-SS War Archives, the Kriegsgeschichtliche Forschungsabteilung der Waffen-SS, and it also provided accommodation for between 80 and 120 SS men. From 1945 to 1990, the building was in use by various departments of the Soviet and GDR military, its historical significance entirely forgotten. Today, it is shared by the Oranienburg Tax Office and the administration of the Brandenburg Memorial Foundation. The former office of the Inspector of Concentration Camps, which to a large extent is preserved in its original state, now holds a documentary exhibition entitled The Inspection of Concentration Camps, only a short walk away from where you are now standing. Please note that, unless you have already done so, you should obtain a code number from the Visitor Information Center to gain access. From 1934 to 1939, the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps was led by Theodor Eicke, and from 1945 by Richard Glücks. The desk murderers who worked in the Inspectorate were important executors of the racial extermination programs of the Third Reich. It was here that the central execution of the final solution operations for the European Jews and for the Sinti and Roma was coordinated. They coordinated the mass murder of all the Soviet prisoners of war in the concentration camps and the euthanasia program. Not only were accurate registers of all the mass murders kept here in this building, but also records on each individual prisoner killed. It was here that the conditions of imprisonment were laid down, the meager per capita rations, the types of forced labor, and the nature of the punishments that could be meted out for various offenses.
From 1942, this was the bureaucratic center for planning the systematic terrorizing of the inmates in the camps. When the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps became part of the SS Economic and Industrial Administration Office, the Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, in 1942, the forced labor concentration camp inmates for the German armaments industry, the exploitation of the prisoners, and their extermination by work was centrally coordinated from here. On either side of the Hans von Dohnanyi Straße, as it is called today, you can still see the houses of the so-called SS residential estate of Oranienburg. This comprised 33 detached and semi-detached houses built between 1938 and 1940 for the SS leaders working in the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps and their families.
In today's Bernauer Straße, formerly called the Adolf Hitler Damm, there are still 6 representative villas for the top SS bureaucrats of the organization. In one of them, from November 1943 onwards, lived Rudolf Höss, together with the family of another SS leader. Having gained experience as a Schutzhaftlagerführer in Sachsenhausen in the years of 1938 and 1939, he coordinated the Auschwitz concentration camp project from about 1940 on, eventually becoming its first commandant. He made Auschwitz into the feared human death mill that it was, establishing it forever in the memory of the world as the hub of the extermination program against the European Jews, Sinti and Roma. In 1943, Höss returned to Oranienburg, where he worked as the head of the Central Coordination Office of the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, responsible for the treatment of the prisoners and for the mass murder operations in the concentration camps.
From 1945 to 1990, the building was used for military purposes, its historical significance almost forgotten. Today it is shared by the Oranienburg Tax Office and the administration of the Brandenburg Memorial Foundation.
Thanks for watching, everyone. See you on the next episode.